Next, we have another influential critic who happens to make a careful analysis of poetry and the important characteristics or important skills that a poet actually needs in order to bring about better poetry. So, Horace was the son of a tax collector. He lived around the 1st century BC in Rome. He studied it at Athens, was also a close friend of Virgil, and he lived in the Augustan age with great poets like Ovid, Livy, and Virgil. So, along with these poets, we cannot imagine a better age in poetry where the energy of inventiveness and the energy of this strict adherence to form can merge into an age of prominent literary production. So now we will be dealing with the key concepts that were actually propagated by Horace. So, as we all know, Ars Poetica is actually a very influential work when you are considering literary critics, and at the same time the formation of a theory of literary productivity, because only based on Ars Poetica, many critics manage to come up with this assumption that there must be a standard handbook of writing poetry, there must be a systematic study of poetry, and there must be some documentation regarding the aspect of good writing. So his Ars Poetica was actually intended as an epistle or a letter to Piso. Piso was actually a Roman consul who happens to have two sons, and one only for addressing the true purpose of writing poetry and the true the important aspects of writing poetry, that Horace actually wrote this epistle. So in his advice to young poets, he comes up with many different points that a poet needs to keep in check if he is if he wants to write better poetry. For instance, in his advice to young poets, he urges them to follow classic models. So this particular notion of following the predecessors or following those of the classical age is a very prominent feature that you find in almost all the literary critics that we are going to see in this particular class. So another important thing that Horace would like to suggest in his Ars Poetica would be that a poet need not go through extreme lengths to be bizarre and at the same time to be quite abnormal in order to find that originality that could place him among the greats. And he at the same time should understand that he is part of a tradition. This is something that is very unique, that Horace has brought into the understanding of the whole history of literature, because he tells that a poet should understand that he is part of a tradition that was built by the poets of his preceding period, and he and his contribution will only be judged based on the tradition that he is a part of, he is inevitably a part of. So one a very important quote that has to be mentioned from Horace would be this: study the Greek masterpieces, pore over them night and day, because this is something that is very often repeated whenever people try to quote Horace. And the secret of all good writing is sound judgment. He implies that poetry, he is very much against this notion that poetry should be completely driven by imagination. He tells that there are certain rules to writing poetry, and these rules should be followed. For instance, if we happen to come to this particular slide, he tells that there are certain definitions to certain genres, and the poet has to understand that his technique or his meter or his themes should be concurrent or should be logically applicable to the subject matter that he deals. And with regard to subject, the Horace deems it quite important to know the limits of each poet, because no poet is of equal excellence and no poet is well versed in all areas of life and philosophy. So he urges them to take a subject which they could handle quite easily, to handle any subject, to handle the subject at any cost, and only if they are only if they are equipped with that ability to discern their own capacity to handle a particular subject and choose it, they could then apply the meter or the theme that is much required of that particular subject. So another important thing that Horace actually takes from Aristotle would be that Aristotle was the first person to give poets their place in the formation of the healthy formation of culture in the society, because he was the one who told, which is quite going against his own teacher Plato. He was the one who told that the poet's object is to teach as well as to delight, and using that particular theory, Horace redefines it and rephrases that as it is the duty of the poet to give instruction and at the same time entertainment. And Horace gives a much rather practical and at the same time much more marketable opinion when he goes into the actual purpose of writing poetry. He tells that the purpose of poetry should either be to profit, because he mentions that if a poet happens to write in a much more obscure manner using archaic words or archaic phrases that do not apply or do not appeal to the contemporary audience, he tells that that particular poem will not be published. And he also adds that even though a poet can be so talented and he could be so well versed in his techniques of writing poetry, but he should have the patience to listen to his critics, especially those people who point out his mistakes. And he tells that before publishing the poem or before bringing the poem to the public arena, a poet should manage to get the approval or should manage to get the support of almost 100 to 500 poets or judges who should make a comment or who should make a judgment on his own poetry. So Horace's way of defining the good qualities of a poet is quite practical and it's quite applicable to every poet. So when we come to another important aspect with regard to Horace, he asserts the fact that poetry and painting are so similar, and at the same time their interpretation requires the same fortitude or the same acumen that is required in a critic. So he tells that in a painting, there are some paintings that should be judged based on how close you look at it, the details that are present in it. But some paintings should be looked from a distance. So not every painting is judged by the same tool or judged by the same method. So since different paintings require different methods of interpreting, this is the same with poetry. He tells that poetry also needs a special kind of attention depending upon the theme, depending upon the type of poetry. The critic has to make a completely different methodology in order to interpret it. So moving on from Horace, we can just tell that Ars Poetica is pretty much the most influential work produced by Horace.